All right, so we are going to do our last set of notes for imperialism, and we're looking at China and Japan. So what I have here are just some terms of interest for imperialism in China. So we have the Opium War, the Treaty of Nanjing, extraterritorial rights, Taiping Rebellion, open door policy, and the Boxer Rebellion. So when we look at China and we look at what's going on, they are definitely getting a lot of pressure from the West. And one of the big things that we see here, when the foreigners want to come in and they want China to open trade for them, they don't want to have to follow any of the laws that are in China. They should be exempt, is how they're going to see that. And then what we're going to witness as we go through these notes is how the Chinese people are not going to embrace the fact that the foreigners are coming in and trying to receive special treatment, and then also bringing in their religion and their Western culture and trying to completely revamp everything that's within China. So I do have this set up a little differently because with your reading, you had some questions. And the very first question you guys had to answer said, describe China's two major attempts to remain isolated from the outside world. And the first part of answer to number one actually focuses on the time period before we start to see colonization within China. Because in the 1700s, China was a self-sufficient nation. They had a very strong agricultural economy. They had industries in silk, cotton, and ceramics. They had mines that produced salt, tin, silver, and iron. And really, there was nothing they wanted from the European world. There weren't any products that they were needing to buy from them. So really what China had in the beginning was a favorable balance of trade. They were exporting more than they were importing. And they were very strict in allowing the Europeans to come in and trade within China. So they had it limited to just one port so they could manage everything that was going on. But for the British, they needed to come up with a product in order to get into China, and hoping that the people would want a particular product and then open up trade for them even more. So when we look at the resistance that's coming from China in the early 1800s, again, China had very little interest in trading with Western nations. And this has really been the case even back in the 1400s with the old imperialism, or the age of exploration. The British did import large amounts of tea from China, but they did discover a product that people would want if they could get it into the country. And it's not that the British first introduced opium into China. I mean, it was a drug that was used for medicinal purposes, so it was very regulated. But now the British are smuggling this drug into the country because it's a very highly addictive narcotics. And the Chinese government actually sent a request to Queen Victoria to get her ships to stop bringing this into, smuggling it into China. And her response was pretty much she's not going to stop it. And a war does break out between the British and the Chinese. And in the end, the British actually do gain a foothold in China. And this is looking at the Opium War. I'm going to backtrack here a little bit to this first one. So when you go back to the Treaty of Nanjing, that did end the Opium Wars, but it also gave Hong Kong to Great Britain, and that becomes crucial later on as we continue throughout the rest of the year of what goes on in Hong Kong and how it's going to be a little different than the rest of China. So China is going to wrestle with reform. I mean, you do have the Chinese government resists modernization, but the self-strengthening movement does produce some changes. Western nations and Japan are going to end up gaining a sphere of influence within China. We saw that with our Motives for Imperialism activity, where we were looking at the partition of China, and not only in a poem, but also in a political cartoon. And up here in the top, we do have another political cartoon which shows like the cutting of a pizza pie, and it has leaders from the various countries who are going to come in and carve up China. This is when the United States wants to step in and say we really need to have that open door policy to assure trading rights for all nations. This idea that they're protecting China from colonization, I mean, it's what happens to China is not going to be the same as what happened in the continent of Africa, but it still is allowing all of these countries in to gain trading rights, not in a way to benefit China. So we're definitely going to see the rise of nationalism. The government at this time really was not in a position to really crush the rebellions or even refuse what was coming from the Western world. A lot of frustration was building up with the government, especially since you have a lot of foreign nations that are coming in who receive special privileges. They're exempt from following any of the laws of the land. And a group will come together and become known as the Boxers, and they are going to set out to try to remove all Western influences. They don't like the fact that there's a spread of Christianity. They don't like, the different customs that are coming in from these Western powers. And they are going to rise up and try to prevent it. For them, they are going to be defeated, and we definitely start to see some more changing for reform, but more so on the way of allowing that Western influence to continue to come into China. So the second half of question 1 would be the Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s. The Society of Harmonious Fists did set out to rid all of Western influence in China, but they weren't successful. Japan's going to take a different approach. With Japan, they saw what happened to China, and they're not wanting to fall like they did to imperialism. With Japan, the United States actually approaches the Japanese government, and with that approach, they left some of our Navy ships out in the harbor with the cannons and the guns pointed at Japan. And they requested that a couple of ports be open to American ships to work with trade. And they also included in this letter that if the answer is no, then please remember to look at our Navy sitting out here with all of their weapons pointed at you, and we can bring even some more in. So Japan saw that really in that instance, they had to cave in. So they do open up 2 ports and allow for American ships to come on with trade. But as we go through, we're going to see that Japan realizes that they do need to modernize. And how they do this is that they send off people to the various countries, and they want them to determine what is the best practice, the best government, the best school system. What do these nations have to offer that they could then bring back to Japan and model after? So when they set out to modernize, when they went to England, they realized that England had the best navy. So let's structure our navy after England's. They liked the strong centralized government that Germany had. So let's bring a strong centralized government here. They liked the American education system, this public education system. So let's bring that type of education system here. And they also set out to become an industrialized nation. So they build railroads, they get their coal mines, and they start building factories. But one of the things that we have to realize about Japan, Japan is an island. So with all of this expansion that they're doing on their island, especially when you look at industrialization, they are going to need to expand beyond their island for the resources, and that's going to play out a little later. So with this Japanese nation, we definitely see that they are strengthening their military, and they are becoming an empire. They will become an imperialistic empire. Now, we are going to see 2 conflicts here. The first is in the Sino-Japanese War, and the next one will be the Russo-Japanese War. Well, when you look up here at the map, so we have Japan, our island, we have China, and then we have Korea. Now, even before this time, Korea is kind of in the middle place between Japan and China, and there's been some trade and, there's been interaction between these three nations. Japan and China, of course, my dog would have to go barking at the door at that moment. Japan and China would both like to have a hand in Korea, but they agreed to remain neutral. But the deal is, one cannot go into Korea and have any kind of influence. Well, the Korean government is actually going to deal with a little bit of an uprising, a revolt, and they seek help from China. China then does send troops in to help the Korean government with what was going on with an uprising. For Japan, that was a violation of their treaty of neutrality of Korea. And then that sets off the first Sino-Japanese War. In the end, Japan is successful and they are able to gain control over Korea. Now, what we will discover as we start to move forward through the 1900s, through World War I, the interwar years, and into World War II, is that Japan learned from the imperialistic nations on how to be a colonizer. And we're definitely going to see a lot of harsh treatment of the people when Japan comes to conquer them and take them over. And that's what's going to happen in Korea. We're going to see that we're not going to use Korean language in schools and different changes with the laws and being treated as second-class citizens within their own homeland. In 1904, we have another clash, but this time it's going to be with Japan and Russia. So right up here in this top part where it's kind of like a purple color, we have Manchuria or Manchukuo. And above that is part of the Russian Empire. Well, again, Russia, still trying to get that warm water seaport, moves into that area. And Japan sees them, sees what's going on, and kind of, I see what you're doing. Going to point out, we're not going to venture out to Korea. You need to stay put. I can handle only so much. Stay where you are. But Russia, believing that they are a stronger nation, they are a massive empire. They cover 2 continents. They're going to go for it. They're going to go into Korea. And then that's going to set off this Russo-Japanese War. What is going to shock the world is that the Japanese Navy will destroy the Russian Navy. I mean, remember, they did model their own Navy after the British. And we know that Russia has had a rough time catching up with everyone else. Japan is an industrialized nation, and they are destroying what Russia is sending down to fight them in Korea. Port Arthur is falling, and even Tsar Nicholas II's advisors are telling him, you need to pull out. You need to pull out of this war before they defeat us. Because when they do, it's going to be the shock heard throughout Europe, and the other major countries are going to look at them like, you are weak, and we can come in for the taking at any time. Particularly Germany. Germany will see this will be a prime time, knowing that Russia had lost against what they will consider itty-bitty Japan. But itty-bitty Japan is an industrialized nation at this time with a very mighty military and navy in the Pacific. These 2 pictures here, the one at the top was one that we'd actually used in an IB class. And it really demonstrates, when you look here at the Japanese soldiers, I mean, their attire, they've really embraced that Western influence. I mean, that modernization that they were setting out to do, that whole idea, if we can modernize more like them, then we can also prevent them from taking us over. Where you have here the men from China, they're still in that traditional setting. So it definitely shows how through this imperialistic action that's coming from the European nations, how one nation is desperately trying to maintain to their traditional way of life and one has set out to, we're going to become like the imperialists so that we are not taken over. The picture down here is of the attacks against the Russian Navy and how unsuccessful Russia was against Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. So looking at our last two questions, which cover Japan, what was the result of Japan's feelings of pride and strength in the late 1800s? They felt equal to the other countries. They were able to ask the other countries, for a certain amount of time, they allowed for special rights to be granted to the foreigners who would come in to those two ports and trade, where they were given special privileges. And then eventually the Japanese government had requested that those things were eliminated, that they weren't given special treatments. And those countries agreed because they really didn't feel threatened by Japan's government. I mean, they saw that Japan was really modeling themselves after a lot of the European nations, so they were okay with saying, fine, no more special rights given to our people in your ports, because those ports will still remain open to them. And for Japan, they felt that they were now equal to those European nations, that they were on the same playing field. And they really wanted to demonstrate that power and their might in Asia. And they're going to continue to want to do that as we move through World War I and when we get to the Paris Peace Conference with the decisions that will be made with dividing up territories and the roles that various countries are going to play when we create the League of Nations, that international organization that's supposed to create peace throughout the world. And then our third question, what method did the Japanese modernize? So through what method did they use? They began to act like European powers. Not only did they model their government, their navy, their school system after great powers, whether it's European or even the US with the public schools, but then they also started to behave like them with expanding their power and taking over territories. I mean, the war against China over Korea, that was one where there was a disagreement over the fact that China had went into Korea when they weren't supposed to go in Korea, although they were asked to come in by Korea to help to crush a rebellion. But the fact was it was a violation of their treaty of neutrality over Korea. But then with Russia, this was an on-out, we're going to fight over this territory because you were told not to expand down into this region close to us. Japan's going to continue to behave like we saw with the European powers. They become an imperialistic nation. They do need to gain more resources because they are an island and they are becoming industrialized. And with that war against Russia, it is clear again, with Russia, it's like you really have to catch up here, that if you are not industrialized, you're not going to win. So the fact that Japan could defeat Russia, that was just such a shocker to everyone. All right.